I'm at the Capitalism and Morality Calgary seminar, which brings together strong minds to discuss the philosophy of freedom and liberty. The event features great thinkers such as university professors and political leaders. I grabbed a few interviews with some of the speakers to narrow down some of the great points they discussed.
In the 19th century, Democrats fought for the equality of all citizens under the law and their right to govern themselves against the despotic power of kings and small cliques of aristocrats. But conservatives and classical liberals were united in the belief that power had to be limited. They adopted constitutions that clearly outlined the powers of governments and the rights and freedoms of citizens that could not be infringed upon.
Maxime, how has centralization imposed problems in Canada?
Oh, what we have right now, we have a government that does not respect the Constitution, because in our Constitution, that's not about centralization and all the powers in Ottawa. It's about a radical decentralization and more autonomy to provinces. Now, Ottawa has one idea, and that must be the same one in every province. But the problem is there is different culture in this country. Quebec is different than Alberta. Alberta is different than PEI. So we must believe in more decentralization that will give more autonomy, and we'll have, a united country with different policies at the provincial level. And that must be the way. That was what our father of our Constitution wanted, a decentralized country. And actually right now, the federal government is imposing its view on provinces, on healthcare, on education, on climate change. So provinces must be able to have different policies. The federal government must be in charge of what is important for the national interests of the country: defense, the monetary policy, free trade, open economic union. We don't have an economic union in Canada right now because, you're paying tariff if you want to sell your good that you produce in New Brunswick. In BC, you'll have to pay tariff over there. We must abolish all that. So that's why the best way to keep this country together is to have a radical decentralization and respecting provincial autonomy.
So one of the big questions in political philosophy or political science is the notion that the state cannot truly force us to do anything, but we do it anyway. We comply. Why is this? How does this work? This is a question that was critical for Rothbard and Hoppe in their writings. They basically said that the state, no matter how bad and how evil it is, requires at least the tacit consent of the people. And so the lifeblood of the state is ideas.
Again, this key idea that any state, no matter how apparently democratic or despotic we might see it, the real thing that props it up is the ideas that people have about it. And even just kind of a tacit, reluctant consent is enough to sustain government. And so you have to change those ideas, and those ideas are something that's inside all of us. So people's ideas about the government, about the state, about what they expect from the state, that's the most important thing when it comes to changing the system. And like I said, it's not about the knowledge of what the bad guys are doing, it's what you expect the state to do for society. And I think that's the key idea that I wanted to emphasize.
And what are the negatives of statism?
It supplants the wishes of individuals by the preferences of people who are in positions of authority, right? So rather than people making decisions on their own and the ends they wish to pursue themselves, it's somebody else in a position of authority who is imposing their preferences on the rest of humanity.
Are there any additional comments that you would like to extend beyond the crowd today?
No, this was a fantastic event. Hopefully it will continue. And there is a lot of interest in libertarianism in Alberta. And I think events like this are going to succeed in the future and get larger and larger. I hope the organizers keep up the great work.
So when we study economics, we tend to learn it in terms of what I call the economist gang sign. you ever seen that? Supply and demand? That's how economists, when you meet another economist, you know that they're on the same level. That's right. But it's a static system, right? There's no change happening. And one of the things that I torture my students with in the beginning of my courses is, well, this is the economy. Point out where the entrepreneur is. Where is entrepreneurship? Where is change? Of course, it's a trick question, because there is none. It's a static system.
How destructive are regulations to our economy?
Well, a whole lot more than most people realize. Because the problem is not only that we don't get what we regulate away, but also that we instead get other things, which might seem like a good thing. But the problem is that when you invest in something and you create a production process and you create new machinery, maybe establish a factory and things like that, in something that is not really where entrepreneurs would want to be, well, that puts those resources into action in the wrong place. And of course, entrepreneurs, they build off of what has already been done, which means you sort of cement this kind of distortion in the economy long term.
We've been advocating for here today is that we adopt principles. If conservatives love liberty, if they want to see the state rolled back, they have to stand on principle and actually shift culture the other way. And that can't be done from the top down, unfortunately. It has to be done from the bottom up, from the grassroots up. So conservatives out there, stop relying on political power to make the changes you want, because it's only going to rely in a further move leftwards, but instead talk to your family and friends about the principles that Western civilization was built on, the sacrosanct nature of the individual and how society ought to be protected and government ought to protect it, rather than and talk about what the proper role of government should be, rather than simply arguing for whatever the liberal policies were 10, 15 years ago.
Currently, right now, we have the Alberta election with Danielle Smith, leader of the UCP, and Rachel Notley with the NDP. A lot of Danielle Smith's policies involve decentralization and privatization. What would you say to those NDP voters who are essentially worried about her decentralization?
But they must believe in themselves. They will have more control. The best government is the government that is near the people. And, if she's doing decentralization and giving more power to municipalities, that's good. People will be able to decide what to do. People will have more autonomy. So, I'm saying to people, when you have a one fit solution for everybody, that's not our society. We have different jurisdictions with different priorities. So, and what you want to do here in Calgary must be different than in Edmonton. So, decentralization for me, that's the solution, not only at the federal level, but at the provincial level. Mayor of municipalities must have more power, because people can go and do their grocery and meet and having a meeting or a chat with their mayor, so he will know what is happening in the city. And if you don't do what people want at the municipal level, you won't be able to be elected, and they will have people at the municipal level have a direct impact on their policies from their people. So it's always better to give more power to the lower level of government.
The left, of course, likes to blame the system. There's very much a victimhood mentality, and it's always, they did something to me, the bad guys did something to me. But what if our character is the main factor in what happens to us and the people who rule over us? So what if we change the way we think about that? What if we take some responsibility for it and understand that it's our ideas that prop up the system that is oppressing us? So in a way, we're kind of like our own worst enemy.
Why should there be less government control over our agriculture?
Well, one of the important things about agricultural activities is that it involves entrepreneurship. And when entrepreneurs, agri-entrepreneurs, have the freedom to satisfy the wants of final consumers with what they want, where they want, producing products in the form that consumers want, this leads to resources being used in their most profitable and productive ways. And when governments interfere with this process, less ultimately is produced, and at higher cost, resources are less profitably employed, and ultimately there is less of other goods and services that are produced for consumers to access.
You mentioned that entrepreneurship is the driving force behind the economy. Can you get us a deeper understanding of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So what entrepreneurs do is really they envision what things could be like, what the economy could be like, and what sort of products that might change people's everyday lives. And they set out to produce those things. And then, of course, customers choose whether to buy them or not. So there's a lot of risk involved too. But they make the investments into creating something that they envision, that they hope is going to change the world.
And my goal is to be in government as soon as possible to promote what is good for this country. Like, in Canada, you don't have any discussion about the equalization formula. The mainstream national political parties don't want to speak about, Western alienation. We must have that discussion. We'll bring discussion like that, like climate change. Every national establishment politicians agree with the Paris Accord. We won't, we'll withdraw. So I'm having that discussion right now with people in Portage, Lisgard, and I hope to be elected based on the real conservative family values, and we'll start that common sense revolution that will be good for every Canadian.
What is the ultimate playing factor that keeps people poor?
Well, what keeps people poor is that they don't have opportunities. And the reason they don't have opportunities is because it's been made really costly to do certain things. Very often it's about barriers to entry. So entrepreneurs can't create businesses, and people have to get a job in order to pay taxes and pay rent and so forth. And they therefore have to choose to work for one of the few employers that exists. Because there are artificial barriers to entry, there are fewer jobs, and that's keeping people out of the job market, and it's keeping wages low.
So what are some changes in policies we can make to change that?
Well, it's about allowing entrepreneurs to enter the market and to compete with. We see this a lot in the economy, that established incumbent businesses, they lobby to raise the barriers of entry. There's a reason why in the US, when they're talking about raising the minimum wage, why Amazon and Walmart support this. It's not because they want higher costs for themselves, but because they know that they can take it. So that the next Jeff Bezos, who's going to create something that's going to disrupt Amazon, can't create that because the costs are too high. So the incumbents always support high barriers to entry because it protects them from potential competition.
How does statism poorly affect societies?
Well, look, statism is the belief that essentially we need to initiate force or impose on the individual or their property. Okay, so essentially it's the belief in normalizing a criminal cartel that has a monopoly on a given territory and saying, look, that criminal cartel is actually good. We need it to do things. We need it for roads. We need it to feed the poor. We need it for education and healthcare. But of course, the only means the state has at its disposal is violence. Now, violence might be useful in a couple situations to protect the individual from being raped, assaulted, murdered, stolen from, but it's not there to solve all the things that need to be solved in society. Violence isn't a good way to solve homelessness. It's not a good way to feed the poor. It's not a good way to even regulate business. And so statism is the belief in using violence to solve these problems. So it's an outsourcing of personal responsibility. If I as an individual can say, there's some poor people over there, I don't like it. I see some people starving, I don't like it. I'm going to vote for the state to rob some money from people and fix that problem. Well, now you've outsourced your personal responsibility to the state. Instead, you should go over there, take personal responsibility, see what you can do for those folks, see what you can do to improve their circumstances, organize some people if you need to, but do it on a voluntary basis. Don't outsource it to some people to do violence. You wouldn't do violence to solve that problem, so don't ask the state to do it to solve that problem.
Summer is here, and Rebel News store has some hot picks for the summertime. Head to rebelnewsstore.com and check out some of our items. Thank you for joining me today. Stay strong and stay free. For Rebel News, I'm Angelica Toy.